Hi, I'm Sue Stockdale, and welcome to episode 113 of the podcast, the last one in this current series of Access to Inspiration. And we've got a treat for you. My guest today is Elise Wortley, who recently took part in the Channel 4 TV show Alone in the Canadian Wilderness. Elise shares what she learned from the experience of being dropped off in the middle of nowhere and having to fend for herself in the wild. And if you thought that was difficult, Elise is also now on a mission to redefine what it means to be an explorer with her project Women with Altitude, where she follows in the footsteps of early female adventurers, using the same clothing and equipment that they would have taken at the time. I hope you enjoy what she has to say. And as always, you can follow along with a transcription on our website for this and all our episodes. Just go over to accesstoinspiration.org. Welcome to the podcast, Elise. It's lovely to speak to you today.
Oh, thanks, Sue. Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
I love speaking to fellow adventurers, if I dare call you that. And you've certainly had an adventure of late, out there alone in the middle of the Northwest Territories in Canada, I understand.
Yes, it's quite funny actually you say adventure, because I always call myself a bit of an accidental adventurer. Like I never really meant to get into all this, but it's now become my life and I love it. Last year, actually, I was in the Canadian wilderness. It was for a new Channel 4 show called Alone. So yeah, I was dropped in the middle of nowhere in the middle of Canada and had to fend for myself in the wild, which was the most amazing, beautiful, tough experience I've ever had.
Was it wonderful all the time? But I suspect if it was challenging, maybe not.
Yeah, so it's interesting watching it back because obviously on the TV show, they just take out the most extreme bits because they want the show to be dramatic. So it was a bit funny watching it because I did actually, for the most part, have the most wonderful, immersive, great time. I mean, obviously I was hungry because I'd never hunted or caught fish before or anything like that, but I knew that would be part of it. But that was one of the reasons I did it really, was to become fully immersed in nature and to just leave modern day life behind. So it was a really wonderful experience. But yeah, really, really tough at times, especially because I'd never built a shelter. I'd never really used an axe. I'd never been fishing. I mean, I've been on lots of adventures, but I've never actually had to properly fend for myself and live in the wild before. So yeah, it was completely crazy, to be honest. Really crazy.
And would you say now that you feel competent to do that in the future?
Yeah, I would love to go and do it again. I'd absolutely love to have the chance. I mean, I'd maybe take a bit more food with me this time, but it was just that whole being there on your own, just listening to nature, just being in nature. You become completely wild. So my hearing got really good, my eyesight got really good, and you just become part of it. You know, you go to sleep when the sun goes down, you get up when the sun rises, and your whole rhythm just changes. And it's really sad for me now that my wildness has sort of slipped away. So yeah, I'd love to go back and do something similar, maybe somewhere else.
Very often people, when they're in challenging situations, and we've had several guests on the podcast who have found that it's their mindset, what they're saying to themselves, that really makes the difference. So what were you saying to yourself?
Yeah, over the years, I've got a lot better at being kinder to myself. I used to be really tough on myself. I used to suffer from really bad panic attacks and anxiety. And during that time, I was really hard on myself. Sort of, why can't you just be normal? Why can't you do this? Why do you have to ruin everything because you feel dizzy or you don't feel right? So actually, over the last 10 years, I've gone on this journey where I've just really accepted I just need to be kind to myself. And that really, really helped. I think as well, it was almost my naivety. I'd never fished before. I'd never made a shelter. I'd never done any of that stuff. So I was just like, oh, well, it's fine. You know, I haven't caught a fish today. I might just be doing it wrong. So I'll try over there tomorrow. I'll see if that works. Whereas I think if I'd actually known that I was fishing correctly, you know, and I was in the right place, that would have been more demoralizing. So I think it was a bit of naivety, but also that just being kind to yourself and knowing that you've done big things before, you know, you've got through certain things and you can get through this. So yeah, I think just being kind to yourself is probably the main reason that I got through it.
So I want to just dig a little bit deeper into how you came to realise that you love nature so much. Thinking about you when you were a youngster, that had an influence on how you viewed nature.
Yeah, I was born in London, but then my parents moved out to Essex, in the countryside. And I actually grew up just always in the dirt, always building dens. We had a little wood behind our house. So I was always in there with my brother. So I had a very, very outdoorsy childhood. And then when I was a teenager, I sort of rebelled against that and I just wanted to be in the town with my friends. And when I look back, that's where it started. Yeah, I lost that connection with nature. And then I went to uni and then I moved to London and it just had completely gone. This is something I've realised recently. I'm obviously trying to get that nature back into my life. And it's making me feel so much better. So that's definitely where it came from, I think, growing up surrounded by it and just sort of wanting that back.
You mentioned before that you had suffered from anxiety and panic attacks. How did you help yourself to get to where you are now?
So it was a really long road for me. And actually, I was 20. So that was 13, nearly 14 years ago. And actually back then, I'd go to the doctor and I'd say, I'm really dizzy. I'm shaking all the time. I feel like something awful is going to happen. And they didn't really know what to do. I had brain scans. I had blood tests. I had all this stuff and they were like, there's nothing wrong with you. And obviously now that would be different because they'd be able to recognize, oh, it sounds like this is something that's going on in your head, because that's one of the things with anxiety. It can make you feel so physically ill and like there's something really wrong. So I think back then it was just a lot of disappointment, not knowing what was wrong. And one of my main symptoms was constantly feeling dizzy. So I'd be looking around and I wouldn't be able to focus on anything properly. And it was really, really horrible. And I think just kind of managing to get through that. And eventually I went on medication because I just wasn't getting better. And it got to the point where I couldn't go out and I couldn't get on a bus because my legs would shake so much. I wouldn't be able to move it was really, really bad. So it was actually medication and therapy that then got me through. It kind of got me back to my normal self. And then I was able to say, I can be this person. I'm not that old one who's terrified of everything. And that's kind of when all the adventuring started happening. And I went on my first trip to India. And then I've just got better and better since then. So I would say to anyone in that situation that I was back then, your brain can change and you can get better. It's just a process that you have to go through.
And seems like you were prepared to go through that journey.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely times where I would think, oh, what's the point? I feel so terrible. I can't even leave the house. There was times when I didn't think it would get better, but I can look back on the last 13 years now and see how far I've come. Even just talking to you now on this, I wouldn't have been able to do this sort of 7, 8 years ago with this sort of confidence that I have now. So even the little things in the day as well, like going to work, I enjoy it. I like talking to people and I didn't used to have that. So it definitely takes time, I'd say. But definitely.
Now, you also threw into your answer there a couple of countries that you have travelled to. And I think that's with your project, Women with Altitude. Is that right?
Yeah, I actually started that when I started to feel a lot better. So when I was around sort of 26, I remembered this book that I'd read when I was younger by a female explorer. And I'd always wanted to follow in her footsteps. It was just this idea that I thought was silly for a long time. But she was so inspiring. She was called Alexandra David Neal. And she went on this really long 14-year journey through Asia in 1910, I think she started. She was the first Western woman to meet the Dalai Lama. She studied Buddhism. She lived in a cave for 2 years, just studying Buddhism and meditation, which sort of in 1910 was really rare for a woman, especially to go and do this. And she wrote this incredible book about her experience. And I just remember reading it and thinking, wow, she did that back then. That's so brave to even go somewhere where you've probably only seen one little photograph of. It's not like today where we can see exactly where we're going. We know who's picking us up, that sort of thing. And I just always wanted to follow in her footsteps because her book was just so magical. The people she met, the places she saw. So eventually I went and I did it. But the big twist was I did it in what she had in 1910 because I wanted to really, really experience what she had gone through. And I thought, well, if I'm in modern clothes, I'm not really going to feel the elements and the nature and actually the hardships she went through on that journey. So that's how it all started.
And did you have an idea then that you would record it on a video? Because you're in the PR industry as your day job, so you know how important communication is to obviously getting sponsors and so on. So what attention did you give to that as you were dreaming up your journey?
Yeah, so I decided to take a team of women with me because I wanted the trip to also show other women that you can go on these adventures. And the other thing was I wanted a female guide. So I worked in adventure travel at the time, and I knew that there was a big sort of gap, especially in Asia, between women who do jobs in the adventure world and men. It's definitely a man's sort of role. And it is changing a lot, especially in Nepal and India. It is changing. So I found this amazing guide, Jangu, who took us into the mountains and took us on that trip. And then I had Emily come along to film it as well. So just a little group. But yeah, it was this really beautiful group of women and we just sort of went along. But yeah, Emily filmed it and that's when I sort of started the Instagram and stuff like that.
And what did you learn about yourself from that experience, given you wanted to go in somebody else's footsteps?
So because that was the first one and I'd never done a big trip like that before, I won't lie, I was really, really nervous. I was panicky. I was still not in the panicky stage, but I was still coming out of that period. And even sort of getting planes was quite a big thing for me because it was in closed space and it was all very overwhelming. But actually, what I found was when I was there in the mountains, just walking, everything like that went away. And the thing with the old equipment is that you really feel things more. So you feel the wind, you feel the rain. And at first that wasn't that nice, but then you start to realize actually, it was my Scotland trip, which I'm sure I'll talk about in a bit, that really got me into this. But I used to see rain as horrible, but now I realise it has a place in the ecosystem and I know how it feels to get as wet as the plants. It sounds a bit airy-fairy, but wearing that stuff sort of gave it that element as well. So I think I just learned that when I was in nature, in the mountains or anywhere in nature, even the park, I've felt so much better. So that was kind of that first trip. And then I sort of got a bit addicted to it. And then I found all these other women that I started researching, female explorers from back in the day who were under-celebrated compared to their male counterparts. And I've got a list of about 150 now. So that's how it all carried on.
And given that you were inspired by your own experience and you've got this big list now, is it important to you that you experience this? Or is there something about you would encourage other women to take on some of those adventures and do it as a collaborative? Given that you were on the Channel 4 programme called Alone, I'm wondering how much of it is about you and on your own versus you with others or other people doing something that's in service of your mission.
It's a really interesting question because that sort of reason I started sharing it was to show other women that, yes, these women did these things back then and they were so brave to do it, but I couldn't have done this a few years ago. So even if you're going to the park or you're going for a tiny walk, like that's still a little adventure and you should still really push for that. I've thought a lot over the years about doing group trips because I'd love to get a group of people, not necessarily all women either, but everyone to put their phones away and just sit around the fire for 24 hours, something like that. And I had it on Alone as well. There's something really magical when you do put the phone away and you have no distractions. It's a bit like meditation. So your whole mind stops. You're just looking at the flames of the fire, or you're just listening to a bird, or you're listening to what someone else is saying. And actually in a group setting, that's a really, really lovely thing. So it's definitely something I'd love to do in the future, is to take a group of women. I mean, they can wear the old equipment if they want. I'm sure people would want to, but it's more about that sort of disconnecting from the online world and all the stresses and just playing with fire and sticks and building somewhere to sleep in maybe. So I would love to.
I'm wondering, and I know from my own experience of some of the polar expeditions that I've done, that it can be very hard when you have to just go inside your head and you've got no one else to speak to on a regular basis. And I'm wondering, when you were there having to cook for yourself, having to hunt, how did you accept that it was just down to you?
Yeah, it's hard. And don't get me wrong, I sounded very positive about it at the start, but there were definitely some darker moments. I just reminded myself the whole time I'd not done this before, so everything's a test for me. It was that constant not catching anything, sort of another day goes by and you haven't got any food, and another day. And then it is really hard. I mean, I'm sure you know about this, when you're in loads of pain and you just think, I don't think I can do this anymore. And then somehow you just carry on. And you just get through it. And it's realizing that you can do more than you think, I think, is one thing that I really learned from it. And it's stressful having all that on your own shoulders. You have nobody to lean back on. It's all on you. And if you think about it like that, it can become overwhelming. So you just need to take it step by step, I think. Well, I've tried this, I've done this. or I've got to get to here, I've got to keep going for another hour, and just break it down into small amounts. And that's sort of what I did on Alone as well. I was like, well, I've tried this, I've not caught anything here, so I'll try over there tomorrow. And then at the end of the day, if I don't catch anything, I don't catch anything. But I think that's kind of it, just kind of narrowing it down and not thinking about it too much.
Now, if you're enjoying this episode about adventure, then take a look at our playlists. We have one on adventurers and explorers that features 10 of the most popular adventurers that we've interviewed, who've been to many different parts of the world. You can find it at the website accesstoinspiration.org. I hope you enjoy it. Now back to this episode. You mentioned Scotland, Elise, around one of your project trips to follow in somebody's footsteps, Nan Shepherd, I understand. What happened there?
Oh, I love Nan Shepherd. I think my mum recommended me her book, The Living Mountain. I'm sure you might have read it. It's just amazing. And I'd never read a book like it. And it's actually been described as one of the best books ever written about nature and landscape in Britain. And Nan's all about not getting to the top of the mountain and not just rushing to summit it, but experiencing it as a whole, the whole environment and the beauty that you can get out of just immersing yourself in it. And she wrote that in the 1940s. And it was such a different book. It's very short. It's more like a philosophical text than sort of a normal book. And it didn't get published at the time. So she just chucked it in a drawer. And for 30 years, it just stayed in this drawer. And then it was published, I think, in the 70s. And it's just become this sort of phenomenon. And I think anyone who sort of spends time in the outdoors should read it. It's a really beautiful book. So I went up to the Cairngorms, which is where she lived and where she wrote. And I just sort of dressed in what she had in 1945. And I just followed the book around for a month, just followed all the places what she talks about. And yeah, it was this really beautiful, immersive experience. And I actually always say that really helped me with Alone, because I was on my own for the first time, just following this book. And it was the first time that I'd actually sort of done nothing, which sounds a bit weird. So like in the evenings, and I'm sure you might have had this on some of your polar trips as well. The evening comes and you make your dinner and you're like, well, now what? Because I didn't have any modern technology to distract me. So I just sit there, watch the sun go down, and then I'd be like, oh, well, I'll go to bed now. And actually just that sitting, doing nothing, we don't really do that in our normal lives. So that really taught me to slow down and to appreciate all the different elements of nature that she writes about so beautifully, and that they all have a place. Like, I don't mind rain anymore. I used to really not like rain, but Nan's taught me that it has its place and it can actually be really beautiful. That was an amazing trip.
And did you encounter any midges, which is one of the facets of Scotland?
Yes, I did. But I would say not as bad as I thought they were going to be. But I did always have a fire going. And then obviously after dusk, they sort of go away, don't they? But yes, I had a lot of bites on my legs.
And for any listener that doesn't know what a midgie is, it's like a mosquito, and they can get very, very frustrating.
Yeah. And they're quite small and there's a lot of them, but their bites are awful.
Yeah. You're describing to us your life-changing, life-affirming experience in nature on these journeys that you've participated in, Elise. How do you bring any of that back into your regular job, your regular life? Because it can seem so different, I imagine, from what you're doing day to day.
Yeah, it's a funny one. I actually live in London, so it's very different to a lot of the places I've travelled to. And I mean, especially when I got back from Alone, it was a big shock. But I always try and get to the parks. I always try and put my head out of the door in the morning to get a bit of sunlight. And I've learned to be a lot calmer, because the thing in London, everyone's rushing around. You can't just walk somewhere at normal pace. Everyone's going a million miles an hour. Everyone just works really late. And I've just learned from doing all these things just to sort of be a bit slower, so I won't constantly rush, try and get out into green spaces. And it does actually really help me mentally as well. And when I look back to my mid-20s, I just started working. Everyone just works and goes out and drinks, and it's just this constant cycle. And I can really see I was in that, and now I've taken this big step out of it. And I do a lot more sort of yoga and meditation and walking, a lot of walking. And I also just carve out a bit of time to do nothing. So it sounds a bit weird, and sometimes my boyfriend will come in the room and I'll just be sat on the bed just staring at the wall. I'm like, I just needed 2 minutes of nothing. And I've definitely learned that from watching the sun go down and sitting there and just not doing anything. So yeah, little elements of all the trips I think I use every day, really.
And if there was a leader of one of those large corporate businesses in London where everyone's rushing about listening to this podcast, what would you say to them that might inspire them to change the working environment for those in the organisation?
I think just make sure everyone carves out time for lunch or isn't always working till 8 p.m. or that sort of thing. Just make sure everyone has a bit of time, even if it's a coffee break, make that essential. Don't let people just work through, because I know a lot of people that do, or organise staff walks or something like that. We actually have something similar where I work. So there'll be like a lunchtime walk once a week or something like that. And it's just really nice. Everyone just leaves their screens and goes and talks and goes on this walk. And I think just getting back to nature always seems to help me, and it always seems to relax me and slow me down. And I think that's really key. So I definitely recommend something like that.
So what's next on your agenda then? Because it strikes me, if you love nature so much, you want to be connected to nature, and then you're still in London. Why London? Or is it in your plan to move elsewhere so that you can be surrounded by nature more of the time?
Yes, definitely my plan to move. I think it's just work and all that sort of thing. I've just sort of ended up here. All my friends are here. So it's quite a big thing to move. But I literally am constantly looking where to move to. Yeah, I think maybe soon. And then I've got lots of plans for trips in the future. So in December, I'm going to go to the Lake District and do a little trip following in the footsteps of Dorothy Wordsworth, who was actually one of the first women on record to start writing about nature and mental health and how it can actually help us get out. So I'm going to go and experience that. And then one of my big things I want to do next year is climb Mont Blanc, but as Henriette d'Angeville did in 1870, I think it was. And I think her outfit that she did it is still in the museum in Chamonix. So I want to try and get that. I'm not sure they'll give it to me, but I need to try. So that's the plan.
And how do you expect or hope to fund those things?
So I'm starting to look now. It's definitely got harder, I'd say, over the last few years to get money from companies. But I think when you get press and things like that, it's a really good thing to go to companies with and show them. And I've got a few that I've been writing to, so just have to wait and see. And sometimes it's about using a few different companies and they will give a small amount. But I think with something like Mont Blanc, it's maybe worth finding a company that already takes people to climb it and then trying to work through them. So, but yeah, it's like a whole nother job on the side. I mean, I'm sure you know from your polar trips, it's a big to organise these trips, especially because it's usually just me. One of the things I would really love is to get commission from a TV channel, and that would be a really great way to fund it, but obviously that's very difficult, but we're trying, so we'll see.
Well, if you can achieve all the things that you have done so far, then I'd absolutely see there's no reason why you can't accomplish these things that you're hoping for as well in the future. Given we're the Access to Inspiration podcast, Elise, who or what inspires you?
Oh, that's a really hard one. Well, I obviously have all these women from the past that inspire me. But I think as well, I've met so many people through this project as well. And people like my guide, Nadia, who was my guide in Iran, and these female guides in the world that are really in a man's world. It's not usual in a lot of countries for women to be adventure tour guides. So it's meeting people like them, actually. So Nadia and Django, people that I've actually met that are just doing so much for their communities. And it's very humbling to see. And it makes me want to be a better person when I meet people like that.
My final question for you, if you're fast forwarding in your life and saying, okay, looking back at all the things that you have done and I'm imagining you hope to do, what do you ultimately want your legacy to be from all of these projects?
Oh gosh, I've never thought about that, but that's a really good way to look at things, isn't it? I just want to inspire other people, I think, as well, to say you don't have to sort of climb the biggest mountain in the world or do whatever to have an adventure, and anything's possible. So I get a lot of people saying, I could never do it in the old stuff. And I just think, well, you've not tried. I'm sure you would be absolutely fine. So I just hope that it inspires other people to go on adventures and get out there and not necessarily think you have to live by the normal sort of ways that people do, I suppose. But yeah, it's a really tough question, that, because it's hard to sort of put yourself as that person.
Elise, if people want to find out more about you and follow your adventures and get in touch, how might they do that?
Yes, so I've got Instagram, which is Woman with Altitude, and then the same for my website, so womanwithaltitude.com. And I'm always up for a chat, so feel free to message.
Wonderful. I really wish you well in your future adventures as part of this Women with Altitude project, and no doubt you'll go on to even better and bigger and more impactful things in the future too.
Oh, thank you so much.
It's been lovely to speak to you. Thank you.
You too. Thanks so much, Sue.
Well, thanks to Elise for her inspiration and a reminder about the important connection between nature and well-being. Well, we're now taking a break to connect back to nature, and we'll be back early next year with more episodes to keep you inspired. Until then, you can also keep up with us on social media or sign up to our newsletter, and you'll be able to do that at the foot of the homepage on our website. Thanks, as always, for your support for our podcast, and keep letting us know what you're enjoying about these episodes. We do love getting your feedback. Look forward to connecting with you again soon.